Hi, I'm Forrest Emmel. I'm here for another episode of Art Punch. I'm going to be going over my process for making a character illustration, and we'll see how that goes, I guess. Here we go! So, I wanted to start this video off by talking about the composition that I decided to go for this illustration. And in order to talk about that, I wanted to bring up a point that my friend David Tilton told me about not too long ago. It was probably a couple months ago or so. I did this image. It just kept getting that weird feeling of like, it feels like there's something missing. It feels like this isn't as good as I could make it. But I didn't know what it was. Like, there's plenty of character illustrations. Just a character in an environment. They're not necessarily even doing anything, but like it still looks good. I was confused, on like why this couldn't work. And it's because I wasn't thinking enough about the composition. So I brought this image to my buddy David, and I was like, hey David, tell me how I fix this. And David was like, dude, that looks boring as shit. And I was like, David, why are you talking like that? But he was right, and it totally was super boring. And it's because there's not enough diagonals. He was kind of right. Now, this being said, having an entire composition based around diagonals is not some magical end-all of this is what you base everything on, but it definitely makes things a lot more interesting. The problem with this image that you can see, like, everything is vertical, even the characters. So David told me, hey, there's not enough diagonals, and I was like, what are you talking about? That doesn't make sense. So I did some research, and what do you know? David was totally right. At the time, I was pretty obsessed with Chris Ron's work because he had just come out with this Johnny piece. I thought it was really cool. It was kind of confusing, I was like, okay, it's just a character standing there, but why does it look cool? Why does this one look so much cooler than the other one? So what is it? Then David told me about the diagonals. And what do you know? There's giant diagonals. Now this, in this situation, makes a giant X shape. That's not immediately what I was thinking. I was imagining a little bit more like, if any of you guys have read Creative Illustration by Andrew Loomis, he has this process where when you start a composition, you start where you want the eye to go into the image, which all this is theoretical. The eyes generally are going to go directly to any sort of a face they see. However, this is sort of a way of leading the eye through the image in a nice, elegant, sort of a calming, whatever the hell you want to call it, way. Either way, there's a lot more energy going on here than there is here. And so I thought, okay, maybe it's just that image. All right. So I went and I found another one of Chris Ron's images. And like the minute I saw the thumbnail of this image, I was like, oh, this is a thing, I guess. I had no idea. I'm pretty sure most people can guess. There's a giant diagonal right there. So diagonals are totally a thing, and that's what I wanted to base this image on. So if we go back to my original image, or my sketch that I'm going to be doing for the tutorial here, this is sort of what I was thinking about the composition. I wanted the eye to come in somewhere down here. I wanted this at an angle that sort of leads in that way. Wanted the eye to get to there, and then go along the sickle, follow the sickle through this dagger here, which leads in the direction of the next sickle. I kind of wanted it to go from weapon to weapon, up to weapon, having all three sickles sort of lead their way through the image. It's not just that. At the same time, I also wanted it to be a triangle composition, which is commonly used for figures of power. It was used a lot as religious imagery, which is possibly why we see it as an empowering sort of a shape. As you can see, I've got this ponytail here, and these tusks, obviously, very equal triangle position. But then it mimics it again somewhere down here, and it kind of goes along this part of his outfit, but then it goes even more. And I kind of just have triangles within triangles. I felt like that was a pretty strong composition. Whether it really turned out as strongly as I had hoped or not is totally up to you guys, whoever likes the image. But I think it turned out alright. So finally, here we go. So as you can see, there's a bit of a jump. Sorry for the filming. I jumped right into colors. I didn't directly go right into values, but I'm still trying to think about values. I usually start by blocking in. I have these all separated on layers, all the major parts anyway. And as things are receding back in space, they're getting a little bit lighter. Atmospheric perspective. So I decided to block everything in color first because, you know, as long as I'm thinking about values still and not just completely putting it off to the side, then I shouldn't have a problem with values. Same goes for color. You know, I know already at the very beginning, none of these colors are final. A ton of these are super muted. They're crazy muted. And I knew from the beginning, like, okay, I'm gonna have harsh sunlight, which is really bright. It's gonna make everything, most things anyway, in the sunlight really saturated. But this beginning part is not that at all. So I'm mainly worried about having some colors blocked in and having the values at least start separated and kind of get an idea of, like, you know, okay, so this is his design, what colors are some of his things, you know, like I can't just have this red-skinned guy, his entire design be warm and expect him to somehow pop out in an image filled with sunlight. So I had to include a few, you know, blue objects and blue parts to him and stuff like that. And that's where his sash and his wrist guard things come into play. So I'm just making sure that all these values are pretty clearly separated. And not super clearly. I'm more worried about not the character as a whole's values being separate and being not the same value. I'm more concerned about everything in the environment being the same value as him. You know, as things recede into space, they're usually going to match whatever the background is, whether, you know, if it's a giant blue sky, things are going to look closer and closer to looking like a blue sky. That's just how atmospheric perspective works. And same with when things get closer, usually they get darker because you can see them a little clearer. They're not as further back into space. So here I'm just kind of double checking the gesture and making sure everything's all good before I kind of jump into things. I'm not, like I said, I'm not super worried about all the values and the colors being accurate at the beginning, as long as I have a nice base to work from. Kind of laying in the, you know, reminders of, okay, there's going to be on the top of these planes, there's going to be some ambient light from the sky, which is going to be just a clear blue sky pretty much. At least that's what I had imagined it being. Kind of, you know, brushing in some mountains and some clouds and stuff like that. Getting a more solid idea of the background. And here I'm starting to block in the sunlight. I'm pretty much just using a really, really saturated orange, but I'm making sure to keep into consideration the values. Sunlight generally, for anyone that's watched my values video, I believe I talk about it in there. Sunlight is usually 40% brighter in value than whatever your base shadow value is. And I started him with a base shadow value. I just like to go that way more. Or start that way more. So I bumped it up 40%, made whatever the shadow color was a little bit warmer. Well, sometimes way more warmer, especially for this red skin here. You have to make it insanely saturated for it being believable sunlight. And that was whatever the color / light was, that was whatever the color / value was that I give it. So I'm kind of going through, checking, you know, where the light would hit, and it's not entirely accurate. You know, I tried my best, and I make some edits throughout the entire video. change some things here and there, and still kind of just mainly concerned about that value separation, making sure that everything in sunlight isn't, you know, all one value. If everything was 30% gray, regardless of whatever color it was, but if everything was about 30% gray that I put in sunlight, but then everything in shadow had their own separate value, then it would look weird. It wouldn't look correct. It'd be off-putting. So I wanted to stop here for a second, so that I can sort of break down what I'm thinking about when I render, I guess. A lot of what I think about when I render is already taken from so many other artists. In fact, the process I'm about to show you is taken directly from a webinar I watched of, I believe his name that I'm gonna butcher in a second now is Dorian Eaton? I don't know. He had a webinar and he talked about his thought process while rendering things, and it's a really technical way, and I really like those technical ways that you can sort of grasp and put words and numbers to. So it's like a set system almost. Even if you don't necessarily think about this system while you paint, it's sort of like a check thing that you can do. Like, oh, right now the rendering doesn't look quite right, or the form doesn't look quite right. Well, how are the values? Does it match this system? No? Well, there you go. You fixed it. In his fancy webinar, he talked about values. I have a values video, but this blew my mind so much that I'm just going to show you guys some more value stuff, because values are how you get something to look pretty realistic. We're gonna make a sphere. And I'm not stealing his whole webinar. There was so much good stuff on it. He also has summer classes. I'll try and find a link for it and put them down below. So we're gonna make a sphere. And this sphere is going to have a base shadow value of, let's go 70%. Yeah, let's go 70%. And for anyone that's watched my values video, I believe I talked about base values. There's a base value of an object, but then that base value is affected by the light and it's affected by the shadow. I like to base every base value I have on the shadow. I don't like it to think of it in its just like its own value as if it was overcast light. So this is the value it will be set at for its bottom plane. If I'm going with an equal scale here, let's say this is in sunlight, you know, or it's in some sort of a bright harsh light, like under a lamp or something. We'll say it's separated by about 40%. It's a pretty bright light. That means that the light side would be 30%. Just like that. So we've got our light side and our shadow side. Now, that being said, it makes sense that whatever the side planes are is the equal number between these two. And this is how I always rendered things, was thinking like this. However, when watching his webinar, he talked about the angle of objects in correlation to the light. So let's say we've got this, totally ripping this off the webinar. Seriously, you guys should watch it if you can find it. So let's say we have this weird oblong shape, okay? It's like an angle thing there. It's a rectangle with a little corner cut off. It's just bright sunlight just shining directly down. So we're gonna have a lot of vertical lines of sunlight. This is the sunlight. It's bouncing on all this stuff. But at one point, the sunlight's gonna go right past something, okay? And that small little corner is where it reaches the 90-degree point. And this is what blew my mind, is that you shouldn't think of rendering, when rendering between light and shadow, as all a smooth transition. At that 90-degree angle point, that's where it jumps to the shadow. And so, in the light, before it jumps to the shadow, how dark does the light get? Because the light's not completely, it's not the same thing. Look at this plane here. This plane is not going to be the same value as these planes. Because these planes are getting direct sunlight, this plane is only getting like half that sunlight. But that's not how the math works. So I'm going to make this really simple. So if you have the light and you have the shadow, the light, the darkest the light gets before it reaches 90 degrees is the halfway point to the shadow. Exactly what we talked about. So just before it reaches the terminator, for those people that know terms like I pretend to, it is that point, it's that 90 degree point. So if the shadow's 70% and the light is 30%, that's a 40% difference. That means go up 20% or down 20%, however you see it. And at 50%, that is how dark that point will get. Now, obviously, this doesn't look correct immediately. You know, there's a lot more that goes into it. The shadow is not a solid plane, so there will be some softness to it. There's going to be a slight gradation, but for the most part, it's really sharp. It's not a huge transition throughout the entire image. So we're going to soften the shadow a little bit here, but it's still going to remain relatively sharp. And as it gets closer towards those top planes of the sphere, things really start to become less and less dark and less of a transition. So by the time you get to the top of the sphere, you really don't see any transition in values at all. So you wouldn't really notice those values on the top of the sphere transitioning at all. But these, you know, you notice a little transition down just that halfway point. But like I said, the darkest that's going to get is halfway between the shadow and halfway between the light. And if you can remember that, it's going to save your life with this rendering stuff. Separate your forms between light and shadow, and then where the light touches the shadow, just before it reaches to the shadowed side, have it be 50% between the light and the shadow. Now, if you're thinking of values number-wise, if you were using that values chart that I talked about in my values video, which you could totally find here, and I totally should have referenced that earlier, that means the light is, if we were using the value scale, I suppose, would be a 3. That means the mid-tone, just the darkest part of the light side, don't think of it as a side plane, just think of it as the darkest light. It's kind of weird, might be weird to get used to, but just think of it that way. Would be 5, and the shadow would be 7. So there's completely equally separated values. And, you know, for the most part, we've got a nice form started here. Now I need to add a little bit more. Terminator's going to be a little bit darker, or it's going to appear darker at least to the eye, because there's going to be some bounce light. Bounce light, from what I've kind of studied about it, usually at most is only one value higher than the initial shadow. Mostly it's saturation that you want to worry about when it comes to that. A lot of this is talking out of my ass. Like I said, it's just studying photos and life. Of course, bounce light can be a little bit lighter than that, but from what I've usually seen. So we're going to have a little bit of bounce light there. And then there's going to be a little bit of ambient occlusion, but not a ton, because it is a sphere. And I'm going to soften there a little bit, soften there a little bit, and we've got a nice fancy ass sphere. Give it a shadow. Cast shadow totally depends on whatever the floor is, so I can't have an exact value for you there, but I'm just going to give it that. And then within the cast shadow, going to be more ambient occlusion. And as it gets further away from that plane, because cast shadows are given through that same 90-degree rule, if the light is going that way, that's that 90-degree point that it reaches is right there. Same with this. I need to make that a little more even. So, I can actually bring that in just a little bit. Bring that in just a little bit. But as it gets further away from that, you can kind of soften the edge. not only soften the edge, but more ambient light comes in too, so you can actually lighten some of that shadow. And I guess as it gets closer, it gets a little bit darker because not as much light is coming in, and it gets a little crisper as far as the edge goes. So that's how I usually think about rendering form and stuff like that. Like I said, totally ripped off another artist, but you know what? That guy's really smart about that. So some of you that have watched my studying habits video, episode 1, might remember that I talked a lot about studying, and I mentioned how, and I still totally believe this, that studying is what got me to the point that I'm at now. Something you might notice is that I didn't do that many studies in this video, and my view to studies has changed a little bit. The problem I had was I was studying too much and I wasn't doing enough from imagination, and so over time I started to become a little bit more dependent on studies. So I've reduced the amount of studies that I do, but I still, I think I do 2 during this whole image. Usually my process for that now is if I'm doing something and I can't figure out what is wrong, or it doesn't look right, or I know I can't do it correctly, then I'll stop whatever I'm working on, I'll do a study, and I'll come back to it. But I'll do a study, and then I will do something else from imagination, depending on how, long of a study it was or something, and then I will go back to the illustration. So I make sure that I really learn whatever I'm trying to do. It's not just for that image, it's something I'm really trying to learn, so that I don't forget it for future purposes. It's like all these rocks in the back, the only reason why I feel confident in doing them is just because recently I had to do, I think it was around 6, I think I did about 6 rock studies, and I applied it to probably about the same amount of doodles, just small little paintings or drawings I did practicing in that same lighting scenario and same kind of stuff, getting that look. So I'm not disproving the study thing or anything, it still totally works, but don't become too dependent on it. Draw a lot from imagination, paint a lot from imagination. So for the most part, it's just been blocking in. I worked up the colors a lot more, made things a lot more orange, a lot more filled with sunlight. I'm including a lot of bounce light in this as well, although you can't see the ground. I'm just sort of implying that, the ground in front of him could be getting hit by the sun, so it's coming up and hitting his pec and hitting his shoulder and stuff like that, hitting that far arm in the back. Here I'm going through with the color dodge layer, trying to brighten up those highlights, make them extremely saturated and bright. Had to bring it down a little bit because it was a little too much. And there, occasionally I'll use an overlay layer on really low opacity, and I'll just fill it with a really bright saturated color, something that I kind of want the color scheme to resemble. This whole color scheme is supposed to be very bright sunlight, a lot of orange, a lot of warmth in it. So throughout the whole video, I sort of work up those colors, work up that sunlight, and I really blow it out a lot, trying to go for a little bit of kind of a cinematic feel. Tried my best anyway. So I had a couple people ask me about the design for this video and ask if it was a pre-made one or not, and I'm working on a personal project right now, and so this design actually was pre-made. Usually for illustrations like this, I don't bother pre-designing whatever character I'm working on. Usually I'll design it within the illustration, which doesn't always work in my favor. Sometimes it really screws me over later in the image, or sometimes usually it's like I notice like a tangent, or values get muddied up someplace, or it doesn't always work out the best, but it's just sort of the way I like to go about it. A lot of this image was inspired by, I don't know how many people would see this in it, but this image was totally inspired by Wayne Reynolds, as well as Brad Rigney and Chase Stone. I don't know why it's something that's in me, but I just love heavily rendered stuff. Something I've been fighting with for a while on, how necessary is it to render certain things, and does everything really need to be rendered and stuff like that. And I don't render things crazy heavily. Usually I render them to a point that I'm satisfied with. I kept fighting myself by the time I was done with this image of like, okay, maybe I should render more here, maybe here. Maybe this is a little too loose here. A lot of stuff like that. But Wayne Reynolds, I love his designs that he does. He's definitely a huge inspiration for any characters that I design. And I studied a lot of his stuff too, just because of how much I like his stuff. But something I really like about Wayne and his art is the energy that he has in it. I talked about diagonals a little bit, and Wayne has a lot of that like sharp energy going everywhere, and I think it's awesome. It's why these blood hands, these blood arm things, while they could be just blobby, floppy little limp blood hands, like, I think it's so much cooler to have them be all sharp and angular and coming out. Like, it just supplies so much more like intensity and energy to it and stuff, and that was inspired by him. And then Brad Rigney always has the coolest cinematic lighting ever, so I always look up to him for that, and Chase Stone and his rendering style as well is definitely huge inspirations. I tried not to get too caught up in the details. It's also why I try not to use photos anymore. The minute that you throw an image, a photo into your painting, suddenly the rest of your painting kind of needs to be at the same level as that photo. If I had photos of rocks in the background here, even if they were a little lower on opacity and painted, they'd still look a lot more real than my character. So I would then have to bring my character up even more, which could be considered a cop-out, but that's not why I'm painting this. At the moment I'm kind of messing around with different brushes, trying to get a good texture for rocks and stuff like that, just sort of playing around with the image. I try to keep a pretty open mind when I'm working on this type of stuff, because I feel like it'd be really boring if all I did was made line art and stuck to that one image that I initially sketched out, and if I didn't have anything, if I didn't mess around and experiment with different stuff. And here I'm kind of adding some foreground dust into the image to try and push the character back a little bit. Just more messing around with brushes, pretty much. Playing around with the image. And right now the blood doesn't look that great. I don't end up fixing the blood for a little while, probably till the very end. I do a study, because I don't paint blood, so I pretty much just have something blocked in at the moment, and do a study of it later and fix it. I think it turned out a lot better. That is why you study, kids, just so you know. so that you don't have shitty blood hands and get embarrassed, because that would be embarrassing. More playing around. For anyone that knows the city of Petra, I don't know how you pronounce it. I think it's in Jordan, but I don't know for sure. It's like this giant, like, city built inside of these desert mountains, canyon things, and it's all sculpted and stuff like that. Like, it's so cool. For anyone that doesn't know, you should totally look it up. City of Petra. So I recently saw some images of that, or I saw it in a documentary or something, and so I thought, like, oh, it could be kind of cool if, like, something like that was thrown into the background, you know, like maybe this isn't just a canyon he's in front of, like, you know, why is this character here? You know, is he just confronting some guy in the middle of a canyon? Well, maybe he's defending something, you know, maybe this is his city that he lives outside of. So I threw, like, that into the background. I thought it could be kind of cool. And I like it, you know. I think it turned out alright. You saw me kind of messing around trying to add form into it, and it just wasn't, where it was popping out too much, and that's something that I'm totally okay with throwing something into an image, even if it's not initially planned, just as long as it doesn't come off as if I threw it into the image and it wasn't initially planned. You know, I can't decide halfway through an image, like, oh, I'm gonna also throw a giant ass dragon and it's gonna be just flying through everywhere. Like, it'd be too much. I really should have painted a fucking dragon though. That's what this painting needed, a dragon. And here I'm kind of messing around with the idea of throwing in splatters of blood. It just got to be a little bit too much. That there was too much for me in the image. You know, it would have been right up in the foreground. It would have been very visible. It's too much to just add at the last minute. So here's a bit of an adjustment to the actual form and the rendering of it. Is even if, you know, realistically these tusks on his face wouldn't cast a shadow on the arm, I think it gives that little bit of believability to it in the image, and having like a nice cast shadow given from something else on the character kind of shows that, like, oh yeah, there's things in 3D space and they cause cast shadows and stuff like that. So here's something that I've never actually done before, but like I said, I like to mess around while I paint, just discover new things. And what's funny is I actually did an image not too long ago after I finished this image and did the same thing because it worked so well for me. So I'm gonna recommend it to you guys. Right now I'm taking a bright yellow for the sunlight, and I'm sort of blocking in all of the things that are getting hit by the sunlight. And my idea behind this was that everything was a little muddied in the values at the moment, like things were sort of going into one another. And I thought, you know, maybe if I grouped the values a little bit more, maybe they wouldn't get so muddied like that. So that's what I started doing. I'm taking this white and I'm turning everything that's being hit by the sunlight, and I'm painting just solid white over it. And then I take the next closest layer, find a color of, you know, not necessarily what I want it to be, but a color that best represents the layer and the positioning that it is in that space. This is mainly for the ambient, or the atmospheric perspective. So that blue, those giant blue mounds of rock in the back, it's just because they're closer to the sky, so they're blue. And I'm having the color wheel go around on the green and yellow side and not the purple and red side to meet up with these rocks. So the next one in front is a little green, a little grayish green, and then it gets a little grayer yellow, and then a little bit more orange, and finally we're getting to these foreground objects that are a little darker. So it's a color transition and a value transition, and it's sort of defining all of these things. And then I lower the opacity, I flatten it all, and then I lower the opacity. And it just grouped everything in such a nice way. Like, I thought it was really good. You know, if your values are starting to get a little bit muddy, and even after checking my values so many times, like, your eyes just get adjusted to the image and stuff, so it kind of helps. So here I'm doing a study of blood. Super quick. This study maybe took me 15-20 minutes. Really wasn't long at all. It was just a basic block in of color. I was just trying to understand the transparency of blood and the consistency of it. You know, how thick exactly it is, how thin does it have to be before some of the really, really bright red comes in. And there's just some notes I jotted down. I sort of made these imaginary thicker points in the blood where it would be a little bit darker. And, you know, I tried taking into consideration where light would bleed through the blood. Well, that was dumb. Where light would come through the blood and would make it a little more saturated than normal. And here I'm kind of throwing the ambient light on top. It's just sort of a reflection of the sky, pretty much. And although this wasn't on the study that I did, there were highlights in the blood, but this is more of me improvising of where, you know, the sunlight might reflect back into the thick tube of blood. You know, it's definitely not 100% accurate, but I got it to a point that I like, and it looks a lot more like blood than it did initially. So it's at a point that I'm happy with it. And here I kind of pushed the arm back in space a little bit, made sure that just because it was part of the character doesn't mean it's necessarily in the same, you know, depth of field as the character. So I had to push it back. At some point I pushed that other arm back on the left side because it's receding in space, so, you know, it'd lose a little bit of the value. So here I'm starting to do an anatomy study. I decided to look up World's Strongest Men, because usually they have a more realistic build, not a bodybuilder build, but where it's really ripped and you can see every single muscle, but it's more of a realistic, soft, round muscles, but very heavily built build. And mainly just thinking about the anatomy here. Like a little bit of the values, because the scheme on the image here is kind of similar. It's a dark-skinned character in sunlight. However, they're mainly in shadow, like the character in my illustration. So I'm trying to keep into consideration a little bit of the values, but I'm mainly looking at the anatomy. I noticed immediately how the anatomy in my image was way too pronounced. It was very comic booky like, where the delta, it was a little bodybuilder like I was mentioning. It's a little too rippling of muscles, and not enough of those large soft shapes, smooth transitions of muscles instead of very rough, hard-edged ones, and that's not really the look I wanted. So I was looking for where those sharp edges would be. Primarily the pec, a little bit into the shoulder and collarbone. The forearm where it meets the bicep, usually where it wraps around, creates a bit of a harder edge. Mainly through foreshortening, but yeah. And especially the abs. I think that's mainly what pushed me to do this study, was the abs were kind of giving me a hard time. It's really hard to make some just natural looking ab muscles. Yeah, and here I'm taking some notes on the values. Just trying to see, you know, how big of a transition does it make from the bottom plane to the top plane. Keeping that into consideration. So far in the image, I hadn't really increased the value when it was going, when the top planes were, when I was painting the top planes, I hadn't really been increasing the value. Or I think I might have been increasing it too much here and there also. So made sure to change those. And here you can see I'm immediately applying that study with the pec. And I softened that shoulder, that back left shoulder as well. I had it more separated, and instead decided to group some of the muscles together a little bit more. I'm still implying that there could be more happening underneath the skin, but it's not such a drastic transition. So I hope you guys learned something, at least, from this video. Hope you guys enjoyed some of those tips and tricks that I stole from other people. Yeah. If you like this video, you might like my other ones, which if you go to my YouTube channel and you subscribe, because you have to do that, you can find first other 3 episodes of Art Punch, for values, for techniques, and for studying habit. If you really liked my video, you can go to these links here. I don't know how YouTube works yet, still learning. I think they'll be here, they'll probably be here. They may be here, they might be here. You should totally follow me on Facebook, DeviantArt, whatever, anything that I'm on, blah blah blah. Thanks so much for watching, thanks for liking my videos, and bye, internet, I guess. Bye.